Writing Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome to Writing Out Loud. My very special guest today is legendary newscaster Ted Koppel. I can't believe you're here, Ted.
That's legends have a legendary. That is so, you reach a point where people use words like that, and what it really means is, joining me now is old, former newscaster Ted Koppel, but you're much too polite to say that.
I wanted to ask you about your naturalization as a citizen of the United States, 1963. Do you think the fact that you chose this country as your home has given you a unique perspective on American politics?
Well, I don't know if it's given me a unique perspective, but I like to say that I'm an American by choice rather than by accident of birth. And, I think as we go through yet another political phase in this country where immigration, legal immigration, illegal immigration becomes such a big issue, it's sort of nice to remember that by coming here, however people come here, and I understand the essence of the debate, people are really paying this country an enormous compliment and saying, of all the places in the world that I could want to live, this is it. And the extraordinary risks that some people take in coming to this country, literally putting their lives and the lives of their loved ones at risk as they cross the border into some of our border states. I know that doesn't justify the illegality of it, but it's sometimes nice to remember that this is such a great country that people are willing to put their own lives at risk just to get here.
Well said. When you and your family came to the country in the 1950s, what were your expectations?
None. None. I was 13 at the time, and obviously came because my parents had made the decision to come, and they made the decision to come. I found out later it wasn't something they discussed with me at the time, because they felt that opportunities for a young man in the United States would be much greater than they were in the United Kingdom. I can't say they were wrong in retrospect. I can't imagine having had the same opportunities and the same chances at success that I've had here in this country if we had remained in England. England is still very tradition bound, at least it was back in the early 50s, by which I mean if you didn't belong to the right family and go to the right school and get into the right university, you were sort of automatically limited to rise this far and no further. And the United States has been always, and I think remains to this day, a great meritocracy. And that's what's so extraordinary about it. Come here and you have the opportunity to make of yourself whatever it is you're capable of doing.
You covered the 2008 Democratic Convention for the BBC. Did you approach that coverage a little differently because it was for a British audience?
No. First of all, it was for BBC America. So it was a BBC broadcast, but one that was shown here in the United States. No, I mean, they hired me to be an analyst, but they hired me to be what I am, which is an American analyst. There's really nothing English left in me, or very little that's left in me. I'm American through and through now.
Of course, the convention was the showdown between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. Obama eventually worked Hillary into his administration. How well do you think that has turned out, incorporating rivals in his administration like he has?
Well, I think that has worked out particularly well because Mrs. Clinton is a really hard-working person, and by all accounts has become a very loyal member of this administration. She understands that while Secretary of State is a very important position, you report to the President. And I have heard not even the inkling of a rumor that she has shown any kind of instincts to grab power to herself and be anything other than the President's Secretary of State. So even though they were bitter rivals during the campaign, they seem to have worked out what the old Romans used to call a good modus vivendi. They live well together.
You became close friends with another Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. How did you develop your friendship?
It really just propinquity, I guess is the word. When you're around someone for a long time, and I traveled with Dr. Kissinger throughout his Middle East shuttle diplomacy, and at one point he did me the honor of asking me to become Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs, which I must say tempted me.
Mm-hmm.
The thought of seeing an administration and policy being made from the inside out was very tempting. But I'm something of a traditionalist in the sense that I believed then and I believe now that you got to make your choice. You pick. You're either going to be a journalist, which means you're on the outside,
Mm-hmm.
looking in and feel free to analyze events any way you want to, or you are on the inside. I don't think, and it's become very old-fashioned to think that way, I don't like the revolving door idea of people who are inside with one administration, then they come out and work as television analysts for a while, or even reporters or columnists, and then go back in again and then come back out again. I don't think you can give full or do full justice to certainly the job of journalist if you have been on the inside and have loyalties that clearly hang on beyond the time that you're in office.
What made Henry Kissinger such an effective Secretary of State?
Well, he's very smart. I mean, very smart. And he understands the interplay between and among nations. And this is both an observation on what made him I think, great Secretary of State, and also an observation on why it is that some of his critics are as disapproving of some of the things he did. He is a realist. You've heard the term Realpolitik, which is a German phrase that refers to people who look at the making of foreign policy on the basis of what are the interests of my nation, what are the interests of this other nation that we're dealing with, and how do we get those interests to gel. There's very little sentimentality involved in that. It has nothing to do with whether people, individuals, get along. And sometimes you have to do some things that, if done by an individual for himself or herself, would be regarded as totally amoral, if not immoral. Unfortunately, the making of foreign policy requires that sometimes. And most great leaders have done things which, if they had done them only in their own interest and not in behalf of a nation, would be regarded as pretty ugly and immoral.
It's a very interesting distinction. It was actually an international standoff that led to your finding a home in late-night television.
Right.
Take us back to the Iranian hostage crisis and the birth of Nightline.
Well, in 1978, the Shah of Iran, I mean, one of the things when you say go back, it's a question of how far back do you want to go. You really have to go back to 1953, and a man by the name of Mohammad Mossadegh was elected in Iran in a free election. He, however, wanted to nationalize the Iranian oil industry and gas industry, natural gas industry. And British Petroleum didn't like that, and Esso in those days, I guess, or whatever, Standard Oil, didn't like it, and eventually British intelligence, MI6, and U.S. intelligence, the CIA, conspired with some military officers to overthrow Mossadegh. And they replaced him with the Shah, who was then a very young, inexperienced man. And the Shah did a great deal to modernize Iran and was a good ally to the United States. But he was tough, and he had a fairly brutal secret service, and there was a great deal of popular anger against him. And ultimately, he was forced out, and he was replaced by the Ayatollah Khomeini. And all of a sudden, you had this Islamic presence in the Persian Gulf. We're still dealing with the aftermath of that today. And a group of people who were described as students climbed over the wall of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and grabbed some Americans and held them hostage. Something similar had happened only about 6 months previously. The U.S. ambassador had come out, had negotiated the freedom of the people. It was over with in a couple of hours. This time, however, the hostages were taken, the embassy was taken, and ultimately they were held for 444 days. It's hard to remember now how obsessed we all were in this country with that event. But we were, and ABC News started doing a nightly special called America Held Hostage, and we began counting off the days that they had been held. America held hostage day 14, day 27, day 46. And the program became so popular that ultimately ABC made the decision to turn it into a permanent broadcast. And in March of 1980, Nightline was born.
Incredibly successful show. You were on there for 25 years. You think about your tenure there. What were your most challenging moments behind the Nightline news desk?
Really, the most challenging aspect of it is keeping it fresh and keeping it interesting every day. And while people tend to be generous and remember the best programs that we did, and there were a few of those, I'm more realistic, and I remember that out of and I did 6,000 Nightlines over those 25 years. Out of those 6,000, I would say probably 5,500 were pretty mundane. You know, I mean, pretty, not all that exciting, but people would tune in because every once in a while you're going to get one of those other 500 that were either very good or on rare occasions just extremely exciting.
Well, one of the ones that's very good, Maury Schwartz. And on your final broadcast for you of Nightline, you brought Mitch Albom on the show. Why Mitch? Why did you want to have a final emphasis on Maury Schwartz?
Because it seemed to me that what people tend to do on last broadcasts is sort of a let's revisit my greatest moments. and I thought that after more than 25 years of doing that broadcast, that it might be more appropriate to focus on one of the only two things that we all have in common. We're all born, and eventually we all die. And there was some resistance initially from the management in New York to our doing the broadcast, the first broadcast, because I remember the late Rowan Arledge saying to me, you know, it's about this guy who's dying. I mean, who the hell wants to watch that? And my feeling was everybody, you know, because we all had that to face, and Maury was one of those very rare people who, in the process of dying, was willing to talk about the process, was willing to talk about what was going through his mind, what his emotions were, what his fears were. And we ended up doing not just one, we ended up doing 3 broadcasts with Maury. And they were among the most influential broadcasts we ever did, because in point of fact, yeah, everybody could relate to this little man lying on his deathbed having, toward the very end, a great deal of trouble just getting the words out. And it wasn't quite someone speaking to you from beyond the grave, but with one leg in the grave. And that's as close as we can really come.
Well, it was your show that actually got Mitch Albom and Maury together, and the result of that, of course, was the best-selling book, Tuesdays with Maury.
Oh, yeah. Well, Mitch was, I think, to a certain extent, he still is a sports columnist. And as he told me, he came back from a basketball game, covering a basketball game one night, went to his motel, flipped on the television set, and heard me talking about this former sociology professor at Brandeis University. He said, whoa, wait a second, that's my professor. That's, you know, he sat down and watched it, had lost touch with Maury, called him up and said, you know, Professor Schwartz, I don't know if you remember me. And Maury said, of course I remember you. And that was the resumption of a really beautiful friendship, and it led to a beautiful book.
Who are some of the journalists who've most influenced you?
Well, I guess the first, obviously, was Edward R. Murrow, because my father actually used to listen when we were in London during the Second World War. I was very small at the time, but my father would listen to rebroadcasts of Murrow's reports from London. The British government felt that his reports would actually be good for the morale of the English public. And so they rebroadcast some of those. And I'm sure my memory is playing tricks on me, but I remember hearing those. And I remember, even as a 4-year-old, thinking, wow, that sounds pretty nifty. You know, I mean, the idea of just being on a plane and flying over Germany and the stuff that Murrow did. And then later on, when I came to ABC, a man who became my mentor was Howard K. Smith, who ironically had been one of Murrow's boys, one of the guys who covered Germany and Europe with Murrow during the Second World War. And a great gentleman and scholar, and someone whom I admired very much.
So what's your quick take on Barbara Walters?
Oh, I love Barbara. I just talked to Barbara the other day. She is eternally young, and Barbara is a pioneer. Barbara has made possible for a lot of women in our industry what is now generally taken for granted and was not when she began. When Barbara began on the Today Show, she was the babe. She was, you know, you do the babe interviews. You do the kind of stuff that women do, you know, girl stuff. And Barbara was tough enough and resilient enough and determined enough to just be there for whatever needed to be done, so that when the opportunity came for her to do something that wasn't girl stuff, she showed just how good she was. I think every woman who has achieved any kind of success in the past 50 years or so owes a great deal to Barbara Walters.
What about Jim Lehrer?
Jim is just, he goes on eternally, doesn't he? I mean,
Yes, he does.
He's like he's like the little battery bunny there. He just keeps, you know, going and going and going. Jim is terrific. I mean, in this age of giving people, you know, news they can choose, the kind of news that resonates to their pre-existing biases. Having someone like Jim who, A, does not underestimate the intelligence of the American public, and B, gives it to you straight, without catering to what he thinks you may want to hear, but just telling you what you need to hear. That's a dying art in our business, and I respect him greatly for doing that.
On your final segment of Nightline, you mentioned that the role of a news anchor is fleeting, that they don't always have the influence that they once had. Do you think that's going to be even more true now that we're not just relying on 3 networks for our news coverage?
Sure. I mean, look, you can sort of track the downward trend over the past 50 years. You know, 50 years ago, I'm not sure if I'm going back too far now. 50 years ago would have been 1960. That's about right, almost 50 years ago. Guys like Chet Huntley and David Brinkley and Walter Cronkite, they were among the three of them. ABC came in, you know, there were only 3 networks and we came in 5th. I mean, it was, you know, it was we were barely in the game. But among the 3 of them, there was not, I would venture to say, anyone in America who didn't know Huntley and Brinkley, who didn't know Walter Cronkite. You know, I mean, for the longest time, kids would be going around, you know, during the day. Good night, David. Good night, Chet. You know, I mean, it was their sign-off, and it became the nation's sign-off. And people forget, but they were ahead of Cronkite. Cronkite eventually sort of caught up and passed them, and then Chet Huntley retired, I think, prematurely. But in those days, they just had enormous stature. And theirs was the light that flickered in front of the national hearth. You know, the nation literally gathered at 6:30 or 7 o'clock around their television sets and got what was generally accepted to be a pretty fair and pretty objective assessment of what the important things were that had happened during that day. And that has just totally changed.
Oh, totally.
And changed to the point that now, I don't think any of the anchors is taken anywhere near as seriously as those men were 45, 50 years ago, and B, none has the influence, and C, the general trend now is to cater to what the public wants to hear rather than what it needs to hear. And I think that has been and continues to be very damaging to the nation as a whole.
It's scary, isn't it?
Yeah.
What advice did you have for your daughter Andrea when she became a journalist?
Well, it was advice that she followed, and it was tough for us. Said, you know, you didn't do any of that when you were in college. You didn't think you wanted to be a journalist when you started, so now you got to learn your trade. And you got to go out and start somewhere where they will hire you and learn it from the bottom up. And she went to a small station in the, it was a national public radio station in the Carolinas. And I remember she was earning so little money that she was on, you know, peanut butter and jelly for the last week of every month because that's all she could afford. And my wife and I were much tougher. She is the oldest of our 4 children, and we were much tougher on her than we were on any of the others. And we just said, you know, you've got to grit your way through this on your own. You know, and she did. And to her enormous credit, she went from there to a radio station in Washington, D.C., to a television station in Baltimore, to another television station down in Miami. And then one day, CNN came to her and said, "We understand you speak Chinese, and our correspondent in Beijing is about to leave. Would you be interested in going?" I think she had packed before she hung up the phone.
Speaking of China, one of your most recent projects has been the wonderful series, The People's Republic of Capitalism. How did that come about?
Well, it came about, ironically, because a young associate producer whom we liked very much, who was working for us at Discovery, who had been with us at Nightline and came over to Discovery with us, came in and sat down with my old friend and executive producer, Tom Batag, and me, and said, "I just want to go, sir. I think I'm going to go to Syria, and I want to go live there, and you know, I want to become a journalist." And we said, well, you know, instead of going to Syria, we've been thinking about doing a series from China. Would you be interested in going over there and just sort of putting down roots for a few months? And you'll be our guy over there, and you will set up some of the interviews and locations that we're going to do. And he said, you know, count me in. And he did. He went over there. Tragically, he was in his early 20s, and he had an embolism to the brain, and he died in Chongqing, in China. It was a terrible tragedy for all of us, but by that time we were so far into this series, and it would have been inappropriate anyway to cancel the series. He had literally invested the last months of his life in it. But that's how it came to be.
We just have about a minute left, Ted, and I want to ask you what you learned from doing that series about China that might have surprised you.
Well, understand, I've been covering China since 1967, when I was in Vietnam but living in Hong Kong. And then I became ABC bureau chief in Hong Kong in '69. I was there '70, '71. So I've been watching the evolution of China, and what that program, what those weeks and months in Chongqing taught me is that the Chinese have arrived. It's going to take them a while before they are able to bring all 1.3 billion people along with them, but they are one of the big players, and very likely will become the big player in the next 50 years.
Let's close out by talking about The Daily Show.
Sure.
But is that fun for you?
Oh, yeah. I'm very fond of John, and I like doing the program.
Even the giant head bit?
The giant head bit I did because John asked me to as a favor, and he has done me favors, so I owed him that one, I think. But my wife thought that was a pretty dumb thing to do.
Ted, it's been so nice having you with us today. Thank you.
My
And
pleasure.
thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.